A man humiliates a black boy on a plane, only to face an unexpected reality check. But the journey takes an unexpected turn when he discovers someone powerful was watching. What price will he pay for his prejudice? And who is this mysterious stranger watching? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Owen Williams drummed his fingers on the armrest of the plastic airport chair, his polished Rolex catching the harsh fluorescent light. The terminal buzzed with activity, but he remained isolated in his own world of spreadsheets and profit margins. His company's future hung by a thread, and this contract was his lifeline. Final boarding call for Flight 237, the announcer's voice crackled through the speakers. Owen gathered his leather briefcase and straightened his silk tie. The weight of his company's financial troubles pressed down on his shoulders like a heavy coat. 20 years of building his construction empire, and now it could all crumble unless he landed this orphanage project. Orphanages, he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. The irony wasn't lost on him, his last hope resting on building homes for children he couldn't care less about. But business was business, and the wealthy firm behind the project had deep pockets. As he made his way down the crowded jet bridge, Owen mentally rehearsed his pitch. State-of-the-art facilities, cost-effective solutions, proven track record. The words felt hollow, but they were just means to an end. The plane's interior was packed and Owen's nose wrinkled at the sight. A child screamed somewhere in the back, and a woman struggled with an oversized bag in the aisle. "Excuse me," she said, but Owen brushed past without acknowledging her. Owen pulled out his laptop, its sleek surface reflecting the overhead lights. The proposal needed fine-tuning, and he had no time to waste on pleasantries. Numbers scrolled across his screen as he adjusted profit margins and construction timelines. The words orphanage and children's home appeared repeatedly in his presentation, but his eyes skipped over them, focusing solely on the dollar signs. Flight attendants moved through the cabin checking seatbelts and overhead compartments. Owen barely looked up when they passed, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he tweaked his presentation. The sooner they took off, the sooner he could land this deal and save his company. "Sir, you'll need to stow your laptop for takeoff," a flight attendant said. Owen sighed heavily but complied, his thoughts already racing ahead to the meeting. He didn't care about the children who would live in these buildings. He didn't care about the impact his work might have on their lives. All that mattered was keeping his company afloat, maintaining his lifestyle, and proving he hadn't failed. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Owen closed his eyes, mentally calculating the profits this deal could bring. The future of his company depended on this trip, and he was determined to succeed, regardless of who benefited from the buildings he would construct. The plane leveled off at cruising altitude, the gentle hum of engines filling the cabin. Owen adjusted his laptop screen, scanning through his presentation slides with laser focus. The numbers had to be perfect. There was no room for error. Aroused behind him, 11-year-old Caden fidgeted with his seatbelt, his small fingers tracing the metal buckle. His heart raced with each slight movement of the plane. This was his first time flying alone, and despite trying to act grown up, fear crept into his chest. "Are you all right, dear?" Mrs. Evelyn Carter, a passenger beside him, asked softly. Her elegant gray suit and pearl necklace spoke of wealth, but her warm brown eyes held genuine kindness. Caden glanced up at her, his voice barely a whisper. "I've never flown by myself before. My mom usually—" He trailed off, his shoulders tensing as the plane hit a small patch of turbulence. Mrs. Carter placed a gentle hand on his arm. "You're doing wonderfully, Caden. Flying can be scary at first, but you're perfectly safe. I've made this trip hundreds of times." Her words seemed to ease some of his tension, and a small smile crossed his face. "Really?" "Really," she confirmed with a reassuring nod. "And look how brave you're being already." After a few minutes, Caden shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Mrs. Carter, I need to use the bathroom." "Of course, dear, it's right up there," she pointed. "You'll be fine." Caden stood carefully, steadying himself against the seat as he made his way into the aisle. As he passed Owen's row, he caught the businessman's eye and offered a friendly smile, the kind of pure, innocent smile only children can give. Owen's eyes flickered up briefly before he turned away, his lip curling slightly in disgust. His body language shifted, angling away from the aisle as if to create more distance between himself and the boy. The prejudice in his reaction was subtle but clear, a silent testament to his deeply held biases. Unaware of Owen's disdain, Caden continued down the aisle, his steps careful and measured. He kept his chin up, trying to project confidence despite his nervousness about navigating the plane alone. On his return trip, Caden carefully made his way back down the aisle, clutching a small plastic cup of water a kind flight attendant had given him. His steps were slow and measured as he tried to keep the water from sloshing over the rim. The plane swayed slightly, making him grip the seatbacks tighter. As he approached Owen's row, the plane hit a small bump of turbulence. Caden stumbled, losing his balance. The cup tilted, sending water splashing onto Owen's expensive gray suit jacket. "I am so sorry," Caden stammered, his eyes wide with worry. "It was an accident." Owen's face twisted with rage as he jumped to his feet, water dripping from his sleeve. He towered over Caden, his eyes blazing with hatred. "You stupid black boy." Owen spat out a horrible racial slur, making several nearby passengers gasp. "Look what you've done to my suit. You people are all the same. Worthless, clumsy." His hand shot out, grabbing Caden's thin arm roughly. Caden whimpered, trying to pull away as tears welled in his eyes. Owen raised his other hand, ready to strike. "I'm sorry, please," Caden whispered, shrinking back in terror. Suddenly, a firm grip locked around Owen's wrist. Mrs. Carter stood beside them, her usually warm eyes now hard as steel. "Remove your hand from this child immediately," she commanded, her voice quiet but sharp as a blade. Her fingers tightened around Owen's wrist, stopping his intended blow. "This little—" Owen started, but Mrs. Carter cut him off. "I said remove your hand." Each word carried the weight of authority. The surrounding passengers watched in tense silence, some half rising from their seats. Owen's grip loosened and Caden quickly pulled his arm free, backing away. His small shoulders shook as he fought back tears. "Return to your seat, Mr. Williams," Mrs. Carter ordered, maintaining her grip until Owen reluctantly sat back down, his face still contorted with anger. Mrs. Carter wrapped a protective arm around Caden's trembling shoulders. The boy's breath came in short gasps as he struggled not to cry, while Owen glared at them both from his seat, seething in silent rage. The cabin remained thick with tension as the flight continued. Owen sat rigidly in his seat, occasionally muttering under his breath about troublemakers and teaching respect. His knuckles were white as he gripped his armrest, jaw clenched tight. A few rows back, Mrs. Carter reached into her elegant handbag and pulled out a small chocolate bar wrapped in gold foil. "Here, sweetheart," she said softly, placing it in Caden's trembling hands. "Chocolate always helps make things a little better." Caden managed a weak smile, carefully unwrapping the treat. His shoulders were still tense, but the kindness in Mrs. Carter's eyes helped calm his nerves. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent. Please ensure your seats are in the upright position and your seatbelts are fastened," the flight attendant announced over the intercom. As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, Mrs. Carter kept a protective hand on Caden's shoulder. When passengers started gathering their belongings, she helped him collect his small backpack. "Let's get you safely to your family," she said, guiding him through the aisle. Owen deliberately looked away as they passed his seat. In the terminal, Mrs. Carter quickly spotted an airport attendant in a bright yellow vest. After a brief conversation and showing Caden's unaccompanied minor paperwork, the attendant smiled warmly at the boy. "I'll make sure he gets home safely," the attendant assured Mrs. Carter, taking Caden's hand. Before turning her attention to Owen, Mrs. Carter gave Caden one final hug. "You're a brave young man," she whispered. Owen was checking his phone when a shadow fell across his screen. He looked up to find Mrs. Carter standing before him, her expression stern but composed. "Mr. Williams," she said, her voice carrying a quiet authority that made him shift uncomfortably. "Your actions today revealed much about your character. Mark my words, there will come a day when you deeply regret treating that child with such cruelty and prejudice." Owen scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Save your lectures for someone who cares," he muttered. returning his attention to his phone. Mrs. Carter turned and walked away, her heels clicking purposefully on the terminal floor. Owen shook his head dismissively and pulled up the directions to his hotel, already focusing on his upcoming meeting. Owen pushed through the revolving doors of Sterling Enterprises, adjusting his tie and smoothing down his slightly water-stained jacket. The morning sun reflected off the gleaming marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows, creating an atmosphere of success and power that made his heart race with anticipation. The fresh scent of coffee wafted from the small cafe tucked into the corner of the lobby, mixing with the subtle fragrance of polished wood and leather. At the reception desk, a young woman in a tailored navy suit looked up with a practiced smile. Her perfectly manicured fingers hovered over her keyboard as she greeted him. "Good morning. How may I help you?" "Owen Williams here for the 9 o'clock meeting regarding the orphanage construction project," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. His fingers fidgeted with the corner of his portfolio, betraying his nerves. "Of course, Mr. Williams. Please have a seat in our lobby area. Someone will be with you shortly." She gestured toward a collection of leather armchairs arranged around sleek coffee tables, each piece positioned to project an image of corporate success. Owen settled into one of the chairs, placing his portfolio on his lap. The soft leather creaked beneath him as he shifted his weight. The events from the flight kept creeping into his thoughts, but he pushed them aside, his jaw clenching with determination. This meeting was too important for distractions. He rehearsed his opening lines silently, fingers drumming against the leather folder, mentally running through his carefully prepared pitch. Mrs. Carter's footsteps slowed as she noticed Owen sitting rigidly in the lobby, clutching his portfolio, his fingers nervously drumming against the leather. A small smile crossed her face as she weighed her next move. She quickly signaled for her assistant, Clara, who joined her in the hallway with a notebook in hand. "Clara," she whispered, keeping her gaze fixed on Owen, "let's see if our guest here is capable of sincerity before I meet with him. I'd like you to handle the introduction." Clara nodded, understanding instantly. "Of course, Mrs. Carter," she replied, stepping confidently into the lobby where Owen waited. "Mr. Williams, I'm Clara, Mrs. Carter's executive assistant," she said, extending her hand. Her grip was firm and professional. "Mrs. Carter sends her apologies, but she's unavailable at this moment. She's asked me to discuss the project details with you on her behalf." Owen's throat tightened at the mention of Mrs. Carter's name, but he forced a smile. "Of course, I understand. Shall we begin?" Straightening his shoulders, Owen launched into his carefully rehearsed pitch. "Sterling Enterprises will find no better partner than Williams Construction. We've completed dozens of major projects across 3 states, all on time and under budget." He pulled out glossy photos of his previous builds, spreading them across the table. "Our efficiency rating is among the highest in the industry." Clara nodded, her pen moving across her notebook. "And what draws you to this particular project, Mr. Williams? What experience do you have working with children's facilities?" "I've always had a special place in my heart for helping children," Owen said, the words feeling hollow even as he spoke them. "The opportunity to build these orphanages would be—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Rewarding." "Interesting," Clara replied, her expression neutral. "Could you elaborate on what aspects of helping underprivileged children appeal to you most?" Owen shifted in his seat, his collar feeling tight again. "Well, naturally, the chance to make a difference." He quickly redirected the conversation. "But let's discuss the numbers. Our cost-saving measures could increase your profit margins by at least 15%. We've developed innovative construction techniques that maximize efficiency while maintaining quality." Clara's pen stopped moving. She looked up, studying him with keen eyes. "You seem very focused on the financial aspects, Mr. Williams." "Of course, that's what makes a project successful, isn't it?" Owen's voice rose with enthusiasm as he pulled out his cost analysis sheets. "Look at these projections. By streamlining the construction process, we could complete each facility 30% faster than our competitors. Time is money, after all." Clara made another note, her expression unreadable. "Indeed. And how do you see yourself personally involving with the children these facilities will serve?" Owen's excitement faltered. "Personal involvement? I'm not sure I understand." My role would be managing the construction. I should mention that this project will require significant hands-on involvement from our chosen contractor. Would that be something you're prepared for? Owen nodded hesitantly, confusion evident on his face. Of course, whatever is necessary. Clara then thanked Owen for attending the meeting, while he booked a luxury hotel and stayed there till the next day. Owen's phone buzzed early the next morning. Seeing Clara's name on the screen made his stomach tighten. "Good morning, Mr. Williams." Clara's voice was crisp and professional. "I'm calling about the next step in our selection process." Owen sat up straighter in his hotel room chair. "Yes, of course. When can we schedule the follow-up meeting?" "Actually, Mrs. Carter has a specific requirement for all potential contractors. We need you to spend some time volunteering at a local NGO that serves underprivileged children." Owen's jaw clenched. "Volunteering?" "Yes, we call it our immersion requirement. It helps ensure our partners truly understand the needs of the children they'll be serving." Clara's tone remained pleasant but firm. "Would you be available to start today?" Owen wanted to refuse, but the thought of his company's mounting debts stopped him. "I suppose I could make time." "Excellent. The address is 1542 Pine Street. Wear something casual. You'll be working with the children directly." 2 hours later, Owen stood outside a weathered building, tugging uncomfortably at his polo shirt. The neighborhood made him nervous. Rundown houses, graffiti on walls, and what he considered suspicious characters on street corners. Clara met him at the entrance, wearing a simple blouse and slacks. "Welcome, Mr. Williams. Let me introduce you to some of our staff." A group of cheerful workers greeted him warmly. A young woman named Sarah shook his hand enthusiastically. "We're so grateful you're interested in helping our kids." Owen forced a smile, his skin crawling at the thought of spending time here. "Happy to help," he lied. Clara led him through the facility. The walls needed paint, the furniture was worn, and the playground equipment looked ancient. Children's artwork hung everywhere, but Owen only saw the peeling wallpaper behind it. "As you can see, we make do with what we have," Clara explained, watching him closely. "But there's always room for improvement." Owen nodded mechanically, his nose wrinkling at the smell of institutional cleaning supplies. A group of children ran past, their laughter echoing through the hallway. He pressed himself against the wall to avoid contact. "The children will be having lunch soon," Clara said. "You'll be helping serve meals today." Owen's face fell before he could catch himself. "Serving meals? Is that a problem?" Clara asked, her eyebrow raised slightly. No problem at all," Owen said quickly, though his insides churned at the thought. At the end of his shift, Owen stood at the entrance, exhausted and irritated. His designer shoes were scuffed, and he was sure he'd never get the smell of cafeteria food out of his clothes. "Thank you for coming today," Clara said. "Mrs. Carter will be pleased to hear about your participation." Owen mustered his most convincing smile. "Thank you for the opportunity." "We'll see you tomorrow then," Clara added casually. Mrs. Carter feels it's important to observe sustained commitment before making her final decision. Owen's smile froze on his face. "Tomorrow?" "Is that an issue?" Clara asked, her expression neutral but watchful. No issue at all," Owen replied, his jaw tight with barely contained resentment. Owen straightened his tie as he strode into the company building, feeling confident after 2 days of what he considered paying his dues at the NGO. The marble floors gleamed beneath his polished shoes as he made his way to the meeting room, rehearsing the passionate speech he'd prepared about his supposed transformation. His steps faltered when he pushed open the door. Instead of just Clara, Mrs. Carter sat at the table, her presence commanding the room. Her elegant posture and penetrating gaze made Owen's prepared speech suddenly feel hollow. "Mr. Williams, please join us." Mrs. Carter gestured to the chair across from her. Clara sat quietly beside her, notebook open. Owen's eyes widened as he recognized her. "Oh, it's you." "From the plane," he stammered, his face flushing with sudden embarrassment. "Mrs. Carter, if I'd known who you were, I wouldn't have acted that way. My mood was off. That's why I acted so rashly." Mrs. Carter raised a brow, her face impassive. "Your mood was off?" Her tone was calm, yet there was a hint of challenge in her gaze. Yes, it was a stressful day, he continued, feeling the weight of her unflinching stare. But I'm here to discuss work, and I'd like to put my best foot forward. Mrs. Carter held his gaze for a long moment, then gave a small nod. Very well, she said, her voice composed. Let's talk about the project. Tell me about your experience this past week, Mrs. Carter said, her voice gentle but firm. What have you learned about the children's struggles? Owen cleared his throat. It's been eye-opening, he began, falling back on rehearsed phrases. Seeing their situation has really touched my heart. Mrs. Carter's expression remained unchanged. Can you tell me about specific children you've connected with? What are their stories? Owen shifted uncomfortably. Well, there's, He scrambled to remember names, faces, anything beyond his own discomfort. There's a little girl who likes to draw, he offered weakly. Her name? Mrs. Carter pressed. I'm not sure I caught it, Owen admitted, his collar feeling increasingly tight. Mr. Williams, Mrs. Carter leaned forward. I'm afraid I can't consider your company for this contract until you demonstrate genuine understanding and care for these children. Your first step will be to find Caden and offer him a sincere apology for your behavior on the plane. Owen's mouth went dry. You want me to apologize to him? Yes, Mrs. Carter said firmly. Until you can show real compassion, particularly to those you've wronged, you won't be qualified for this project. Owen sat there, humiliation burning in his chest, but nodded stiffly. He had no choice. Owen's polished facade crumbled as he sat across from Mrs. Carter in her austere office, desperation creeping into his voice. Sweat beaded at his temples despite the cool air conditioning. Please, Mrs. Carter, you don't understand. My company, we're on the brink of bankruptcy. This contract is everything. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled out financial statements from his expensive leather briefcase, spreading them across her immaculate desk. Look at these numbers. Without this deal, 30 people will lose their jobs. Good people with families to support. I've worked 15 years building this company from nothing. Mrs. Carter's expression remained unchanged, her eyes steady and unwavering behind her wire-rimmed glasses. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across her desk as she spoke. Mr. Williams, your financial situation, while unfortunate, doesn't change what needs to be done. A sincere apology to Caden is non-negotiable. But how am I supposed to find him? Owen's voice cracked with frustration, his usual commanding tone dissolving into something closer to panic. I don't even know his last name. He could be anywhere. Clara, sitting quietly beside Mrs. Carter, maintained her usual composed demeanor as she watched the exchange. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, but her eyes missed nothing. That's not my concern, Mrs. Carter replied calmly, her fingers lightly drumming on her desk. What matters is your willingness to make amends. Without a genuine apology to that child, you will never see this contract. Owen slumped in his chair, the weight of her words crushing his last hopes. He ran his fingers through his graying hair, the reality of his situation sinking in like a stone in water. Everything he'd built was slipping away, hanging by the thread of finding one boy in a city of millions. I'll do it, he finally whispered, his voice heavy with defeat. I'll find him somehow. I have to. Mrs. Carter nodded once, her expression softening slightly. The late afternoon light caught the silver in her hair. Then I wish you luck, Mr. Williams. Owen gathered his papers with shaking hands and stood up. His designer suit, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a costume, too tight around the collar, too heavy on his shoulders. He walked to the door, pausing briefly before stepping out, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The gleaming hallway that had earlier reflected his confidence now seemed to mock him with its pristine emptiness. He pressed the elevator button repeatedly, his mind already turning to where he might begin his search. The airport. That's where this all started. Maybe someone there would remember the boy. Maybe someone could help him find Caden. It was a long shot, but it was all he had. Owen stood at the airport's customer service desk, his fingers drumming nervously on the counter, sweat beading at his temples. "I'm looking for information about a young passenger from last week's flight," he said, trying to sound casual while his heart raced beneath his pressed shirt. The elderly woman behind the desk peered at him through thick glasses, her lined face stern and unwavering. "Sir, we can't disclose passenger information. It's against policy. I could lose my job." Owen's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching near his ear. He tried another desk and another, each time meeting the same response, each refusal making his collar feel tighter. Frustration built in his chest as precious time slipped away. Finally, he noticed a young man in an airport uniform, organizing papers at a side desk, his name tag slightly crooked. Glancing around to ensure no one was watching, Owen approached him, his leather shoes clicking softly on the tile floor. "Excuse me," he whispered, pulling out his wallet, the leather smooth and expensive against his fingers. "I need help finding someone. It's important." He slipped 5 crisp $100 bills across the desk, his stomach churning at what he was about to do. The young employee's eyes widened, darting between Owen's face and the money. He looked around nervously before pocketing the money, his hands slightly shaking. "What do you need to know?" "A boy named Caden traveled alone a few days ago. I need his contact information." Owen's voice was barely above a whisper. The employee's fingers flew across his keyboard, scanning through passenger manifests, the soft clicking filling the tense silence. "There were 3 Cadens last week," he muttered, biting his lower lip. "Wait, here's one. Traveled alone, had an escort service." He scribbled something on a piece of paper, his writing hurried and messy. "He lives at Hope Haven NGO with his mother. She's the director there." The employee pushed the paper toward Owen, already turning away. "That's the address." Owen snatched the paper, scanning the location, his fingers crinkling the edges. His heart sank when he saw it was an NGO. Of course it would be an NGO. Everything about this situation seemed designed to make him uncomfortable, to push him far outside his carefully constructed comfort zone. "Thanks," he muttered, already turning away, shame and disgust mixing in his gut. The young employee quickly returned to his work, avoiding eye contact as if the whole transaction had never happened. Owen strode toward the airport exit, the paper clutched in his hand like a burning coal. The address was across town. He'd have to go there, smile and apologize, all for a contract. The thought made his stomach turn, but he had no choice. His company's future depended on it. Pushing through the revolving doors, he stepped into the afternoon sun, squinting against its harsh glare. He had what he needed, even if he didn't like where it would lead him. The paper in his hand felt like it weighed 100 pounds. The NGO's entrance was modest, with peeling paint and a weathered sign that read, "Hope Haven." Children's laughter echoed from somewhere inside, making Owen's shoulders tense. He straightened his tie, took a deep breath, and pushed open the heavy wooden door. A young woman with kind eyes and a warm smile greeted him immediately. "Welcome to Hope Haven. Are you here to volunteer?" Owen shifted uncomfortably. "No, I'm actually looking for Caden and his mother." The woman's smile dimmed slightly. "Oh, I'm sorry, they're away at a conference for 2 days. They left this morning." Owen's jaw clenched. 3 days? His carefully planned apology would have to wait, threatening to derail his timeline for securing the contract. "I see. Well, I'll just—" "But please stay!" The woman gestured enthusiastically toward a corridor where children's voices rang out. "We'd love to show you around. The kids are doing art therapy right now." Before Owen could refuse, his phone buzzed. Mrs. Carter's name flashed across the screen, making his stomach drop. He answered, forcing cheerfulness into his voice. "Mr. Williams?" Mrs. Carter's voice was cool and measured. "Have you located Caden yet?" Owen glanced at the staff member who waited patiently nearby. His mind raced. "Actually, I'm at Hope Haven right now. It's an NGO where the boy stays with his mother," he said, loosening his collar, really getting immersed in the experience. "Oh?" Mrs. Carter's tone sharpened with interest. "And how are you finding it?" "It's enlightening," Owen lied, watching a child run past with paint-covered hands. I'm learning so much about these children's needs. They are out of town for a couple of days, so I'm staying here with these people. Excellent. I look forward to hearing about your experiences over the next few days. After ending the call, Owen turned to the staff member with a practiced smile. I'm afraid I have another appointment, but I'll be back soon. The words felt bitter on his tongue. He hurried outside, already pulling up his hotel's address on his phone. The Ritz-Carlton would be a welcome escape from this uncomfortable situation. As he climbed into his Mercedes, Owen smiled to himself, satisfied that he'd managed to keep his plans on track without actually having to spend time with the children at that orphanage. Soon after, Owen swiped his keycard and stepped into the luxurious hotel room, immediately breathing easier as the plush carpet cushioned his feet. The stark contrast between this refined space and the worn-down NGO building made him smile with relief. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, and the king-sized bed promised comfort he'd been craving all day. The subtle scent of lavender lingered in the air-conditioned space, washing away memories of musty corridors. Settling into a butter-soft leather armchair by the window, he pulled out his phone and dialed home. His wife Rachel answered on the second ring, her familiar voice instantly warming the room. "Owen, how's it going, honey?" "It's progressing," he said carefully, watching the city lights twinkle below like scattered diamonds. "Just some unexpected steps in the process, but I'm handling it." His fingers drummed nervously on the armrest. "Dad," his daughter Emma's voice chimed in, bright and eager. "Are you going to close the deal?" Owen's throat tightened slightly and he swallowed hard. "Working on it, sweetheart. This could really turn things around for us." "We believe in you," Rachel added warmly. "This contract would mean so much. We could finally renovate the house and Emma could go to that summer program she's been dreaming about. You know, the one with the advanced science courses." Their hopeful voices made Owen's stomach twist uncomfortably. He pushed away thoughts of the NGO's peeling walls and children's laughter, of small hands waving goodbye as he'd left. "I'm doing everything I can," he assured them, his voice steady despite the nagging feeling in his chest. After saying goodbye, Owen ordered an expensive steak dinner from room service, complete with a bottle of aged red wine. As he waited, that familiar twinge of guilt crept back in. The faces of those NGO children flashed through his mind, their worn shoes and bright smiles, but he shook his head firmly. "This is business," he muttered to himself, running a hand through his hair. "Nothing personal." The room service attendant arrived with a silver cart, the wheels whisper quiet on the thick carpet, setting up his meal with professional precision. Owen breathed in the aroma of perfectly cooked beef, grateful to be surrounded by luxury again. This was his world, not that run-down charity with its chaos and need, its broken furniture and hopeful faces. Settling into bed later, Owen adjusted his silk pajamas and fluffed the goose-down pillows, trying to lose himself in the comfort of high thread-count sheets. He could handle 3 days of deception if it meant securing his company's future. Mrs. Carter would get her apology, and he'd get his contract. Simple as that. Yet as he drifted off to sleep, the sound of children's laughter echoed faintly in his dreams. 2 days later, Owen stepped into the NGO, his polished shoes clicking against the worn linoleum floor. The familiar sounds of children playing and laughing filled the air, but this time, his heart skipped a beat. There, across the room, stood Mrs. Carter, her elegant figure unmistakable as she chatted with staff members. "Oh no," he whispered under his breath, his palms growing sweaty. He'd planned for a quick apology to Caden, not an audience with the very person he'd been deceiving. Mrs. Carter turned, spotting him immediately. Her heels tapped steadily as she approached, a gentle smile on her face that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mr. Williams, what a pleasant surprise. I trust you've been spending meaningful time here." Owen tugged at his collar, suddenly too tight. "Yes, absolutely. It's been enlightening." He scrambled for details. "The children they're quite something." "Indeed?" Mrs. Carter raised an eyebrow. "Tell me about your experience these past 2 days." Before Owen could stammer through another vague response, movement at the entrance caught his attention. Caden walked in with a woman who shared his warm brown eyes, his mother. Owen's heart raced as he saw his chance to escape Mrs. Carter's scrutiny. "Excuse me," he said quickly, stepping around Mrs. Carter. "I need to speak with them." He hurried toward Caden and his mother, feeling Mrs. Carter's gaze boring into his back. "Caden," he called out, his voice cracking slightly. The boy looked up, recognition and uncertainty flickering across his young face. His mother instinctively placed a protective hand on his shoulder. "Hello," Owen said, forcing brightness into his voice. "I'm Owen Williams. I've been hoping to speak with you both. You see, I owe Caden an apology for my behavior on the flight." He could feel Mrs. Carter watching, evaluating every word, every gesture. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he tried to maintain his composure, knowing his chance at the contract hung by a thread. Mrs. Carter's gentle smile faded as she turned to face Owen directly, her weathered hands folding deliberately in her lap. "Tell me, Mr. Williams, did you lie to me about staying here for the last 2 days? What activities did you participate in?" Owen's mouth went dry, his collar suddenly feeling too tight. "Well, there were several children." He gestured vaguely at the playground visible through the window, where young voices carried faintly through the glass. "Which ones?" Mrs. Carter pressed, her voice steady but firm, her eyes never leaving his face. "What are their names?" Caden's mother watched intently, her expression shifting from curiosity to understanding, as Owen fumbled for words that wouldn't come. Her fingers absently smoothed the fabric of her worn dress. Owen's face grew hot, beads of sweat forming at his temples. The silence stretched painfully as he stared at the floor's scuffed tiles, unable to fabricate convincing details. The distant sound of children laughing only made his discomfort worse. He swallowed hard, his shoulders slumping beneath his expensive suit jacket. "I haven't actually been here. I was staying at the Grand Hotel downtown." The words came out barely above a whisper, hanging heavy in the air between them. Mrs. Carter nodded slowly, unsurprised, her fingers drumming once on the desk. "I see. So you thought you could simply show up today, offer an empty apology, and secure your contract?" "I needed that contract," Owen said desperately, his voice cracking. "My company?" "We'll have to survive without our help," Mrs. Carter cut in firmly, rising from her chair. "We need someone who genuinely cares about these children, Mr. Williams. Someone who sees them as human beings worthy of respect, not just a means to an end." Caden's mother gently guided her son away, disappointment clear in her eyes. They walked quietly toward the playground, Caden's small hand tucked safely in hers, leaving Owen standing alone with his shame. "I'll be contacting other contractors immediately," Mrs. Carter said, gathering her purse and straightening some papers on her desk. "Good day, Mr. Williams." Owen watched helplessly as she walked away, her heels clicking against the floor. The sound echoed through the hallway, each step marking another nail in the coffin of his last opportunity. He stood frozen in the middle of the room, the weight of his choices crushing down on him as the reality of his situation sank in. Through the window, he could hear children's laughter mixing with the sound of her retreating footsteps, a bitter reminder of everything he'd thrown away. After being denied the most important contract of his life, Owen booked a return flight back to his hometown. The plane hummed quietly as Owen stared out the window, his reflection ghostly against the darkening sky. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the armrest, Mrs. Carter's words echoing in his mind. Someone who sees them as human beings worthy of respect, not just a means to an end. The memory of Caden's face, hopeful yet wary, twisted something inside his chest. For the first time in years, Owen felt small, stripped of his usual confidence. The contract was gone. Bankruptcy loomed like a shadow over everything he'd built. When the plane touched down, Owen's steps were heavy as he walked through the terminal. His expensive briefcase, once a symbol of success, now felt like dead weight in his hand. The drive home seemed endless. Owen rehearsed different ways to break the news, but nothing sounded right. As he pulled into their driveway, the lights from their large house, the one they might soon have to leave, spilled warm and welcoming across the lawn. Rachel, his wife, met him at the door, their daughter Emma peeking from behind her legs. "How did it go?" Rachel asked, her smile fading as she read his expression. Owen set down his briefcase, his throat tight. It didn't work out, he managed, avoiding her eyes. The deal fell through. Emma hugged his legs. That's okay, Daddy. You'll get another one. Rachel guided them to the living room, her hand steady on Owen's arm. Tell me everything, she said softly, once Emma had gone upstairs to play. They went with someone else, Owen said, the half-truth bitter on his tongue. Without this contract, Rachel, we might lose everything. Rachel's fingers tightened around his. Then we'll start over, she said firmly. We could sell the vacation house first. Maybe move somewhere smaller. Owen watched her face, saw the worry she tried to hide behind her strength. The cars, too, he added quietly. We'll need to liquidate everything we can. We'll figure it out, Rachel assured him, though her voice wavered slightly. We're together. That's what matters. Owen nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He stood and walked to his home office, each step heavy with the weight of unspoken truth. Inside, he sank into his leather chair and stared at the financial statements spread across his desk. The numbers blurred before his eyes, red ink seeming to spread across the page like blood. His hand shook as he picked up a pen, trying to make the numbers work somehow. But the empty columns stared back at him, as damning as his own reflection had been on the plane. For the first time, Owen wondered if his prejudice, his lies, his relentless focus on profit over people had led him here. One day, Rachel found Owen in his office late one evening, staring at the same financial papers he'd been reviewing for days. The dim desk lamp cast shadows across his tired face. Owen, she said softly, pulling up a chair beside him. Do you remember what you used to say when we first started dating? He looked up, his eyes distant. What? You get back what you give. Rachel placed her hand over his. You believed that once, before everything became about profit margins and status. Owen's shoulders slumped. That was different. I was different. Maybe that's exactly why you need to remember it now. Rachel's voice was gentle but firm. Instead of focusing on what we're losing, why not think about what you could give? Give? Owen scoffed weakly. Rachel, we're about to lose everything. There are other ways to be rich, Owen. The community center downtown always needs volunteers, people who can help organize, plan. She squeezed his hand. Use those skills of yours for something meaningful. Owen stared at their joined hands, feeling the warmth of her faith in him. A tiny spark of possibility flickered in his mind, though he tried to dismiss it. I don't know, he muttered. That's not really my thing. Neither was being bankrupt, Rachel said with a small smile. Yet here we are, still breathing. Owen leaned back in his chair, memories of his recent failures washing over him. The prejudice he'd shown Caden, the lies to Mrs. Carter, the years of looking down on others. It all felt heavy now, weighing him down. He started, then paused. I haven't been a good person, Rachel. Then be better, she said simply. Start now. Owen thought about the NGO where he'd met Caden, about the genuine warmth of the staff there despite their modest surroundings. He'd dismissed it all then, too caught up in his own importance. You really think volunteering could help? He asked quietly. Rachel nodded. I think helping others might help you find yourself again. After a long moment, Owen took a deep breath. Okay, he said. I'll try. There's a place downtown I could check out tomorrow. That's all I'm asking, Rachel smiled. Just try. Owen stood up, straightening his shoulders. For the first time in weeks, he felt a faint sense of direction, even if the path ahead was unclear. Tomorrow he would visit the local NGO, not for a contract or personal gain, but simply to try something new. Later that week, Owen stood at the entrance of the downtown NGO, his polished shoes and crisp button-down shirt feeling suddenly inappropriate. Children's laughter echoed from inside, along with the shuffling of feet and occasional shouts of excitement. A young woman in casual clothes approached him with a warm smile. Hi there, I'm Sarah. Are you here to volunteer? Yes, Owen replied stiffly, fidgeting with his expensive watch. I'm Owen Williams. Sarah led him through colorful hallways decorated with children's artwork. We're so glad to have you. Let's start you with something simple. We need help organizing our supply closet and cleaning up the art room. Owen's face fell slightly. He hadn't expected to be doing menial labor. Of course, he managed, following her to a cluttered storage room. As he sorted through boxes of crayons and markers, Owen felt the weight of curious stares. Several children had gathered in the doorway, whispering and pointing at the overdressed newcomer. His cheeks burned with embarrassment as he knelt on the floor, sorting supplies into bins. Mr. Fancy Man doesn't know how to stack boxes, one little girl giggled to her friend. Owen's first instinct was to snap at them, but something held him back. Instead, he watched as a veteran volunteer named Mike walked past, high-fiving each child and asking about their day. The children's faces lit up and they eagerly shared stories about school and home. Moving to the art room, Owen wiped down tables and swept the floor, his expensive watch catching paint splatters. He noticed how the other volunteers moved easily among the children, speaking to them as equals, sharing jokes and gentle encouragement. A small boy dropped his paintbrush, sending blue paint across the floor Owen had just cleaned. Instead of scolding him, the nearest volunteer helped him clean up, turning it into a game that had both of them laughing. It's just paint, the volunteer said kindly when she noticed Owen's frown. The mess is worth it when you see how much joy art brings them. By day's end, Owen's arms ached from lifting boxes, and his designer clothes were spotted with paint and dust. But as he watched the children help each other clean up their art supplies, sharing compliments about each other's drawings, he felt an unfamiliar warmth in his chest. Walking toward the exit, Owen paused to observe a group of children and volunteers singing a goodbye song together. Their genuine happiness and connection stirred something inside him, a recognition of value that had nothing to do with money or status. Same time tomorrow? Sarah asked as she walked him to the door. Owen looked down at his stained clothes and paint-splattered watch, surprised to find he didn't mind the mess as much as he thought he would. Yes, he said quietly. I'll be here. Owen adjusted his now casual attire as he entered the NGO for his 4th day of volunteering. The bright walls and children's artwork no longer felt foreign to him. He spotted Sarah organizing books and gave her a small wave. Good morning, Owen. Would you mind helping with lunch prep today? She asked. Sure, he replied, surprised by his own willingness. In the kitchen, he found himself chopping vegetables alongside Luis, a middle-aged volunteer with kind eyes and an easy smile. First time in kitchen duty? Luis asked, expertly dicing carrots. Owen nodded, carefully mimicking Luis's technique. Usually I have people doing this for me. Luis chuckled warmly. Life's different when you do things yourself, isn't it? More satisfying somehow. Throughout the morning, Owen found himself drawn into conversation with Luis, who shared stories about the children while they worked. See that little girl? Luis pointed through the kitchen window. Maria, 3 months ago, she wouldn't speak to anyone. Now look at her. Owen watched as Maria led a group of children in a game, her voice clear and confident. Something stirred in his chest. Pride, maybe, for a child he barely knew. Over the next few months, Owen took on more tasks, organizing the library, helping with art projects, even assisting during story time. Luis was often nearby, offering guidance and sharing his experiences. Why do you do this? Owen asked one afternoon as they sorted through donated books. You could be making money instead. Luis smiled. Some things are worth more than money, Owen. The smile on a child's face when they master reading, that's priceless. Owen found himself thinking about Luis's words as he watched the children play. Their laughter seemed more genuine than any business deal he'd ever closed. Even their small victories, completing a puzzle, sharing toys without being asked, brought an unexpected warmth to his heart. During a particularly busy afternoon, Owen helped a young boy named Tommy with his math homework. When Tommy finally understood multiplication, his face lit up with pure joy. "Thank you, Mr. Owen," he exclaimed, giving Owen an impulsive hug. Owen stood frozen for a moment, then awkwardly patted Tommy's back. He caught Luis watching from across the room, a knowing smile on his face. As the day drew to a close, Owen found himself taking longer than necessary to pack up his things. The thought of returning to his empty house seemed less appealing than before. Luis approached him near the exit. "You did good today, Owen," he said, clapping him on the shoulder. Owen smiled, feeling a genuine sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with money or status. It was a different kind of satisfaction, simpler, yet somehow more meaningful than what he'd known before. The morning sun filtered through the NGO's windows as Owen walked through the entrance. Before he could reach the volunteer desk, small voices called out his name. "Mr. Owen, Mr. Owen's here." Several children waved enthusiastically, their faces brightening. Owen found himself smiling back, no longer forcing the expression. "Good morning, everyone," he said, his voice warm and genuine. As he signed in, a tall, thin boy approached him with purpose in his steps. "Mr. Owen, can you help me with my science project today?" Jamal asked, his dark eyes sparkling with enthusiasm. "I'm building a model bridge." Owen looked down at the boy, noticing how his whole face lit up when talking about engineering. "A bridge, huh? That's quite ambitious." "I want to build real ones someday," Jamal explained, pulling out a notebook filled with careful drawings. "Big bridges that connect people and places, maybe even design buildings like schools for kids who need them." Something in Jamal's determination struck Owen. The boy's resilience, his unwavering optimism despite living in an NGO, reminded him sharply of Caden from the plane. Both boys carried dreams bigger than their circumstances. Throughout the morning, Owen found himself drawn into Jamal's world. The boy's endless questions about construction and engineering, once overwhelming, now sparked something protective in Owen's heart. "Did you know," Jamal chatted while they worked on his model bridge, "that some bridges can support thousands of cars at once? I calculated how much weight different materials can hold." Owen watched as Jamal demonstrated his calculations, seeing not just a child from an NGO, but a future engineer. He looked around the room at the other children, artists drawing at tables, aspiring teachers helping younger kids with homework, a young girl carefully tending to the window plants while talking about becoming a botanist. These weren't just faces in a crowd anymore. Each child carried hopes and dreams, just like Jamal, just like his own daughter Emma. The realization settled deeply in Owen's chest, warming places that had been cold for too long. "Your bridge design is really clever," Owen said, pointing to a specific support structure in Jamal's drawing. "You've thought about weight distribution." Jamal beamed with pride. "Really? I've been studying everything I can find about engineering. The library has some old textbooks, and Miss Sarah helps me understand the hard parts." As other children gathered around to see Jamal's project, Owen found himself explaining basic engineering principles, drawing from his years of construction experience. Their eager faces and thoughtful questions touched something in him, a desire to help not for profit or recognition, but simply because he could. When the day drew to a close, Owen watched Jamal carefully store his bridge model, handling it like a treasure. The boy's dedication to his dreams, despite having so little, made Owen's past concerns about status and wealth seem hollow. Gathering his things to leave, Owen felt different. These children, especially Jamal, had shown him what really mattered, not the size of a contract or the prestige of a deal, but the simple joy of helping someone reach their potential. Over the months, Owen became a central part of everyone's life at the NGO and even helped with reconstruction of several older parts. He coordinated the repairs. He arranged for supplies, some donated by his old contacts, others purchased with the NGO's careful budget. He showed volunteers how to properly seal windows and taught the maintenance staff basic repair techniques. Jamal followed him around, fascinated by the work. "Is this like building bridges, Mr. Owen?" he asked, watching Owen measure a window frame. "Similar principles," Owen explained, letting Jamal hold the measuring tape. "It's all about understanding how things fit together." As the repairs progressed, Owen noticed immediate changes. The children no longer huddled away from drafty windows. The roof stopped leaking during rainstorms. Small improvements, but they made a big difference. Mr. Owen fixed my reading corner, a young girl announced proudly during story time, pointing to the now sealed window that had previously made the space too cold to use. Other staff members began seeking his advice on facility issues. Luis, his mentor-turned-friend, clapped him on the shoulder one afternoon. "You've really thrown yourself into this, Owen. The place hasn't looked this good in years." Owen wiped sweat from his forehead, surveying his work. "It feels good to use my skills for something meaningful." Word spread through the NGO network about Owen's contributions. Other local centers reached out for advice on their own maintenance issues. Owen found himself becoming known not as the wealthy businessman he once was, but as someone who genuinely cared and contributed. At the end of a long day of repairs, Owen packed up his tools. Children waved goodbye, calling out thank yous. Staff members smiled warmly, treating him like part of their team. Looking around at the improvements he'd made, Owen felt a deep satisfaction that no business deal had ever provided. Walking home, he realized he barely recognized the man who had first walked into the NGO weeks ago. That arrogant, prejudiced person seemed like a stranger now. Here, among the children and volunteers, he'd found something he never knew he was missing: a true sense of community. The community center buzzed with excitement as families gathered for the achievement celebration. Owen lingered near the entrance, adjusting his tie nervously. The space he'd helped repair now sparkled with decorations and warmth. "Mr. Owen, Mr. Owen!" Jamal's voice cut through the crowd. He rushed forward, pulling his mother by the hand. "This is my mom. She really wanted to meet you." Jamal's mother smiled warmly, extending her hand. "I've heard so much about you. Jamal talks about you constantly, how you've been teaching him about construction and encouraging his dreams." Owen felt his cheeks flush. "He's a remarkable boy, very bright." "More than that," she said, her eyes glistening. "You've given him hope. Before, he was shy about sharing his dreams of becoming an engineer. Now he can't stop talking about it." The evening progressed as children took turns at the microphone, sharing their hopes and dreams. A young girl wanted to become a doctor to help sick children. A boy spoke about becoming a teacher. Each story touched Owen's heart in unexpected ways. When Jamal's turn came, Owen found himself holding his breath. The boy stood tall, his voice clear and confident. "I want to build things that help people," Jamal announced. "Like Mr. Owen does. He showed me that even when things seem broken, they can be fixed if you don't give up. He taught me that dreams aren't just dreams, they're plans waiting to happen." Owen felt tears pricking at his eyes. He remembered his own childhood dreams, before money and status became his only goals. Watching these children share their hopes so openly stirred something deep within him. Other parents approached throughout the evening, thanking Owen for his contributions. Each conversation revealed how deeply integrated he'd become in this community. Children hugged him, showing off their achievement certificates. Some shared their fears about the future, trusting him with their vulnerable moments. "You're really making a difference here," Luis commented, watching Owen interact with the families. "These kids see you as more than just someone who fixes things. You're showing them they matter." Owen looked around the room at the faces he'd grown to care for deeply. The children's dreams now felt like his own. Their success as important to him as any business deal had ever been. He wasn't here for a contract anymore. He was here because these children, this community, had become his family. The warmth and genuine connection he felt in this moment surpassed any satisfaction he'd ever found in his previous life. Money and status seemed hollow compared to the joy of watching these children grow and dream. As parents and children shared stories and laughter, Owen realized he'd found something he never knew he was missing: a genuine sense of purpose, wrapped in the pure love and trust of these remarkable children. The community center hummed with activity as Owen directed volunteers, helping them set up for the day's event. Children darted around, hanging colorful banners while parents arranged chairs and tables. Over the past 6 months, this place had become his second home, filled with faces he'd grown to cherish. "Mr. Owen," called Maria, one of the younger volunteers. "Someone's here to see you." Owen turned, his heart skipping a beat as he recognized Mrs. Evelyn Carter standing in the doorway. She wore an elegant blue suit, observing the scene with careful attention. Their eyes met briefly before Owen returned to helping a group of children with their science project display. Throughout the morning, he felt her watchful presence as he moved through his usual routines, checking on the building repairs he'd organized, guiding volunteers, and encouraging children with their presentations. He helped Jamal adjust his engineering model, listened to Sarah practice her speech, and coordinated with the kitchen staff about lunch arrangements. During a quiet moment as the children dispersed for lunch, Mrs. Carter approached him. Owen felt different this time. No fear, no desperate need to impress her. Just quiet acceptance of whatever she might say. "You've changed, Mr. Williams," she said simply, watching a group of children wave enthusiastically at Owen as they passed. "I have," Owen replied, his voice soft but steady. "And I owe you my gratitude. Your challenge, it forced me to face things about myself I'd been avoiding. My prejudice, my selfishness." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "I came here thinking I could fake my way through it. Instead, I found purpose. These children, this community, they've taught me more about success than all my years in business." Mrs. Carter studied him carefully. "The change is evident, not just in how you act, but in how these children respond to you. They trust you." "They've given me far more than I've given them," Owen admitted. "When I lost everything, I thought my life was over. But it was just beginning." Mrs. Carter's expression softened. "Sometimes we need to lose our way to find the right path." She smiled knowingly, a hint of something more in her eyes. "Your journey may not be over yet, Mr. Williams." Owen felt both closure and curiosity at her words, wondering what she might mean. But before he could ask, a group of excited children called for his attention, eager to show him their latest project. "We need someone who understands both construction and community needs," Mrs. Carter explained, her voice steady and clear. "Someone who can build with heart, not just profit in mind." Owen studied the plans, feeling a familiar excitement at the scope of the project. But something felt different now. The thrill wasn't about money or success. It was about the potential impact on families like those he'd come to know at the NGO. He set down his coffee and looked directly at Mrs. Carter. "I'm honored by your offer," he began, his voice gentle but firm. "A few months ago, this would have seemed like my salvation. But now—" He paused, gathering his thoughts. "The NGO has become my home. Those children, their families, they've given me purpose. I can't leave them just to chase another contract." Mrs. Carter's eyebrows rose slightly. "Even one this size?" "Even one this size," Owen confirmed. "Money isn't what drives me anymore. What matters is being there for Jamal when he needs help with his science projects, or helping Maria's mother find better housing, or teaching the kids basic construction skills." His voice grew warmer as he spoke about the community he'd grown to love. "The NGO may not pay much, but the rewards—" He smiled, thinking of the children's faces. "They're worth more than any contract." Mrs. Carter sat back, studying him with new respect. "You truly have changed, Owen. The man I met on that plane would never have turned down an opportunity like this." "That man was lost," Owen admitted. "He needed to lose everything to find what really mattered." Mrs. Carter nodded thoughtfully, then leaned forward. "I respect your decision, Owen. But please consider this. These centers could help hundreds of families like those at your NGO. Your experience, your heart for service, they could transform communities across the city." Owen looked down at the blueprints again, seeing them in a new light. "I'll think about it," he said quietly. "Not for the money, but for the impact it could have." "That's all I ask," Mrs. Carter replied with a gentle smile. A week later, Owen stood before his old construction team in the NGO's main room, his hands resting on a table covered with blueprints. Sunlight streamed through the windows, highlighting the determined expression on his face as he explained his vision. "This isn't about profit margins anymore," he said, his voice steady and clear. "It's about creating spaces where children can dream, learn, and grow. Places like this NGO, but across the entire city." His team exchanged uncertain glances. Tom, his senior foreman, spoke up. "Boss, this is different from our usual projects." "It is," Owen agreed, smiling. "Because this time we're building more than just buildings. We're building hope." He gestured to the children playing outside. "Every one of these kids deserves a safe place to thrive, and we can make that happen." To his surprise and joy, his team began nodding, caught up in his enthusiasm. Even Tom's skepticism melted into a determined smile. The project launched with unprecedented community involvement. Owen insisted on regular meetings with local families, NGO staff, and volunteers. They discussed everything from playground designs to study spaces, ensuring each center would truly serve its neighborhood's needs. "Mr. Williams," called out Maria, one of the NGO volunteers, during a planning session. "The children have some ideas for the art room." Owen watched as several kids presented their crayon drawings of what they hoped to see. Their excitement was contagious, and he found himself incorporating their suggestions into the final plans. Word spread about the unique approach. Local news outlets covered the story of the businessman who transformed his company into a force for community good. Mrs. Carter observed from a distance, her quiet approval evident in her subtle smiles. The first center's opening day arrived with perfect weather. Colorful balloons decorated the entrance, and children's artwork adorned the walls inside. Owen stood among the crowd, Rachel and Emma beside him, as Mrs. Carter cut the ribbon. Jamal tugged at Owen's sleeve. "Mr. Owen, can I show my mom the engineering corner you designed?" Owen's heart swelled with pride. "Of course, buddy, lead the way." Looking around at the joyful faces, his family, the NGO staff, his construction team, and most importantly, the children, Owen felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This wasn't just a building. It was a testament to the power of transformation and the true meaning of success. Mrs. Carter approached him, her eyes twinkling. "Well done, Owen. You've built something truly remarkable here." "Thank you," he replied softly, watching as more families streamed into the center. "For showing me the way." If you enjoyed the story of Owen, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.